Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salebox for the 11th of March 2014. My name is TotalBiscuit, with 10 picks from the large selection of discounted games this week. I've put them in some rough order, which is designed to create controversy and annoyance. Numbers, just like every number ever mentioned on this channel, are entirely arbitrary. Let's begin, shall we, with Dead Space 2, 66% off. Good game, as was every Dead Space game in some way. I actually really enjoyed Dead Space 3, but that's probably because I'm not much of a survival horror fan, and Dead Space 3 had no horror in it whatsoever. It's pretty much all action, so I was kind of okay with it. Dead Space 2 is considered by most people, although not all, to be the best of the series. A lot of people really like the original because it was much more survival horror, and Dead Space 2 kind of started the push towards a little bit more action. It is a really atmospheric third-person survival action/horror game. Do watch out for a few things, though. It has an authorization limit on it. They never removed this, as far as I can tell, so that's rather annoying. You've got to sign into your EA account in-game, although that will then throw it onto Origin if you want to use it on there for whatever reason. And there is forced mouse acceleration, which can't be fixed. It's recommended to play this game with a controller. That and the fact that it has been slightly cheaper on Steam before with a 75% off discount means that I would not put this any higher on the list, but at its current price, it's certainly worth it. I mean, there's no real argument about that. I know some people don't like to buy games unless they're $2 or less, but frankly, a game of the caliber of Dead Space 2 is worth the very small price that they are putting it out there for. Crysis 2, also 66% off. You'll notice just another batch of EA games this week. Of course, Crysis 2 is a first-person shooter, and its brother, Crysis, its slightly older brother, is also on the list, a lot higher up, because Crysis was a better game. So the thing about Crysis 2 is that, one, the multiplayer is completely and totally worthless, and there's no point in you even playing it, so the so-called Maximum Edition is not really going to help you in any way. So that's rather annoying. It would be nicer to perhaps get the non-Maximum Edition for a little bit cheaper, but that is the only version that's actually available on Steam, so hey. So yeah, that was kind of useless, and the big thing that some people did not like about Crysis 2 was the fact that the original Crysis was a little bit more free-roaming. It had a bit more Far Cry in there, whereas Crysis 2, much more linear. It's set in a city, you have a few different paths to go through, but it's kind of a corridor shooter with really wide corridors, and by corridors I mean the length and breadth of the city blocks that you have to travel through. What I will say is that it's still a very competent shooter nonetheless, although it can be a little bit easy at times unless you crank the difficulty up, because cloaking in this game is just a little bit overpowered. I would also recommend downloading the community-made high-definition texture mods, considering Crysis 2 is actually the worst-looking game in the series, because it also came out on console, and that affected the PC release even after the installation of their official HD texture pack. You can go even higher than that. I actually did an analysis on it, and I still wasn't massively impressed. So, yeah, it's a good game. It's a good shooter, in my opinion. It's solid. Don't get me wrong. But it's not as good as Crysis 3, and it's not as good as the original Crysis either, so if you're looking for a cheap and cheerful shooter that is still impressive graphically, then Crysis 2 would be the way to go. Just don't expect any free roaming. Race the Sun, 50% off. So this is a cheap and cheerful indie title, which is an endless flyer. It's got this rather interesting chrome aesthetic going for it. Everything else is fairly minimalistic, and it's very challenging. You have to fly as fast as you can. You have to race the sun, keep up with the sun. Otherwise, your solar-powered craft will fall to the ground, which will not be too much use for you. And it's actually really enjoyable to play. It's got really tight controls. It's got, as I said, minimalistic visuals, but they're nice nonetheless. And they have daily challenges, randomly generated levels, and all sorts of things like that going for them. So if you're in for a score attack game, then Race the Sun is a good way to go. And I actually did enjoy it quite a lot, and it is fairly exhilarating. There's currently a level design contest going on for this thing as well, so the Steam Workshop support is a nice addition, and it means that there's a lot more levels for you to choose from. A lot of content here, although the focus of the game is, of course, rather narrow. Number 7, the Undergarden, 70% off. This is quite old, actually. I did a WTF of this several years ago, and I was impressed by the aesthetic and the fidelity of the graphics. It's also a fairly chilled-out title. It's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a puzzle platformer per se, considering that you can kind of float around, so the platforming elements are minimal at best. But it's quite a zen game. It's quite relaxing, and it's also really, really nice to look at. So if you are looking for a game where you can float around as some cute little sea monkey thingy and collect shiny, glowy stuff, then Undergarden is actually stacked full of that. It's really quite cute, and it's a nicely realized indie puzzle sea monkey simulator of some description. It's hard to really describe, honestly. You can't call it a platformer if there's no bloody platforms, can you? But it's fun. It's a nice game. Number 6, Super Sanctum TD, 90% off. Cheap as chips, ludicrously cheap. So this was a bit of a demake of Sanctum, which will also be on this list, pretty high up indeed as well. And Sanctum is a first-person tower defense game. Super Sanctum TD was a retro demake, which is more of a traditional tower defense game. And it's dirt cheap, and it looks pretty cool. Usually I'm not really into the retro aesthetic, but the way that they did it ended up looking pretty good. It looks like an older PC title rather than something on, say, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it's pretty nice. It's got a lot of perks going for it as well, so that's good. It's more of a traditional TD, but the perk system is quite cool. It's also stupidly cheap. Like, it's cheaper than a bar of chocolate, so this is one of those purchases where you can just throw money at it and not really care if you don't like it. But regardless, just know that it's more of a traditional tower defense game, and if you're not into TDs, this is not going to convince you otherwise. Number 5, Painkiller, Hell and Damnation, also known as HD, 75% off. Strangely enough, I've got the other Painkiller on this list higher up, and there's a reason for that. So while this looks shinier than Painkiller Black Edition, it's also lacking some of the content of Painkiller Black Edition. It doesn't have all of the levels that the original Painkiller had. So it was a remake, but they took some of the levels out, which is kind of weird. So, if you are very focused on graphical fidelity as well as the possibility of finding a multiplayer game, then you're more likely to find it in Painkiller, Hell and Damnation. But both of those things will work fairly well for you, I would say. And it's not like this is a bad remake. It looks very good, and it handles very similar to the original Painkiller. And it's got a lot of good content, but the reason it has a lot of good content is because that was from the first game, you know? Of course it has a lot of good content, but it somehow got less than the first game for no apparent sodding reason. They also went a little bit silly with the DLC, I've got to say. That said, they put a fairly unique spin on a lot of it. Like, Heavens Above actually changes the game to a top-down shooter, and that's pretty ridiculous. It takes 5 of the levels and lets you play it top-down. You've got stuff like, say, Operation Zombie Bunker, which is another damn World War II zombie thing, but it does have a couple of new weapons in there, a couple of different types of rocket launcher, as well as a weapon called the Morgenstern. Smite your enemies with a spiky ball at short distances, or deploy sticky mines. New tarot card as well. So some of the DLC is just multiplayer content. Most of it is actually single-player content, and that's all 75% off as well. So I think actually some of this is kind of worth having. And bear in mind, this game also has co-op, which is quite a lot of fun. Number 4 would be the original Crysis, which again is just a better game than Crysis 2 as far as I'm concerned. It is not without its problems, though. The game starts out really, really strong, with you on an island with a bunch of Korean special forces, and it's awesome. Then there's aliens, which kind of ruins it, especially considering that some of the flight sequences are a little bit awful. So it's kind of a game of two halves. Some of it is just some of the best shooting action you'll ever get, especially if you play it on Delta mode, and some of it is just a little bit irritating. That said, it's been heavily modded. There's a lot of really great stuff for it, including all sorts of extreme graphics mods, which are well worth putting on, and it's already an incredible looking game, still to this very day, and it runs really well on modern hardware. So yeah, definitely have a look at it. It's worthwhile for that price, certainly, even if just as a benchmark tool for whatever new GPU you manage to get. Unholy Heights, 50% off. So not a big discount, but it wasn't a very expensive game to begin with, so this brings it even cheaper, much, much cheaper than your average sandwich would be, so that's worth considering. This is actually really fun, and I'm really surprised that I liked it, because this is not the kind of thing that I usually like. It's best described, I think, as an evil fantasy slumlord simulator. You own a hotel, or a tower of sorts, and you rent it out to various monsters, and then you use the monsters to defend your evil lair. and you have to please the monsters by putting in various pieces of furniture. It's cute. And actually quite fun and reasonably challenging at times. It's got a really nice art style to it, which seems a bit cheap, but again, it's cutesy, and it's kind of adorable and colorful. And the tower defense aspects of it are really quite fun. It's a fairly unique spin on that particular genre, so yeah, Unholy Heights is worth a try. Number 2, Painkiller Black. Yeah, now that is a damn game. 75% off, still stands the test of time to this very day as an absolutely fantastic FPS. The only thing that I would levy against it, outside of its obvious age, is the fact that this is an FPS that does not reward exploration. It doesn't have the maze-like levels. It is a set of arenas, yeah? You get locked into a room, you fight the monsters, you go into the next room, fight the monsters, and that's kind of how it goes. What it does have going for it is an excellent lineup of weapons, a really, really good soundtrack, and an awesome, slick movement system that really allows you to build up a lot of speed through repeated jumping. It's also got some monumentally large boss fights, and Black Edition, of course, comes with the expansion, which means that there is a lot of content here. More so than Painkiller HD, although, again, it is an older and slightly worse for wear looking game. And at number 1, I think it's got to be Sanctum, the original. That being the first-person tower defense game, 90% off, unbelievably cheap. You can also pick up all of the DLC for next to nothing as well, if you so desire. Now, Sanctum 2 didn't quite get the acclaim that the original Sanctum did. It's also not on sale, so it might not be something that you really want to look at, but the original Sanctum is something I very much enjoyed. Bit of a co-op focus. It's a first-person tower defense game where you are rewarded through excellent gunplay, as well as placing towers in first person against giant beasties. It is a lot of fun. It also comes with the free Yogg's Cave DLC, so yes, it is Yogg's Cast related. They like this game as well, and both the map packs are also next to nothing as well. I liked it a lot, honestly, but what I would say is that I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing it alone. It's more of a co-op game, it's more fun as a co-op title, but I think that this is a nice spin on tower defense in general, and the price is really hard to argue with, so definite yes for Sanctum. Sanctum 2, especially at that price, since it's not discounted, probably not. And Sanctum 2 has its own problems, certainly, but I think the original Sanctum is original enough of a concept to justify your purchase, especially at that price. Alright, folks, that wraps me up for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Salebox. And I will, of course, be back once there's new games worth having a look at. As for everything else on the list, well, if it didn't make the list, chances are, in my opinion, it wasn't necessarily worth the buy at that price. So there you go. I'll see you next time.